Hello. Today we're going to discuss effective schools and classrooms for bilingual students. This follows along in our language development class, if you've been taking that with me. And it also comes from Baker chapter 13. And so I'll provide a citation later at the bottom of the video. So, this will not only be beneficial for teachers and prospective teachers who are working in bilingual classrooms, but this also helps support students and teachers who are learning in English as a second language classrooms as well. So, one thing that we need to begin with for today is the importance of developing students' first language. This is going to be kind of our overarching conceptual framework for today. So there's countless research on this, but even in the 1950s, for example, there was an emphasis from the United Nations that teaching students in their native language is especially beneficial. It actually leads to the most learning. So students have a right, according to the United Nations, to learn in their native language and to develop their mother tongue or their native language skills. And there's a couple of reasons why students have that right and then why it would be beneficial for them. First of all, just naturally, students who are taught in their native language will more likely store what they've learned in their long-term memory. So when you think about it, when someone talks to you or when you're learning something, you directly often rephrase it or connect it back in your mind in your native language. So, and also just naturally, when you need to communicate with someone, you probably most likely will feel the most comfortable communicating with someone with someone in the language you have the most proficiency in, which is normally your native language. And think about students when they're entering schools. They have a natural inclination to want to demonstrate to their teacher and to their peers everything they know. And the most likelihood for them to be successful is to give them opportunities to communicate and to demonstrate their knowledge in their native language. A second reason is also a political and cultural reason as well. People identify their language with their culture. So if you encourage and support students' native language in your classrooms, you're therefore reinforcing and recognizing students' culture. You're reaffirming their personal identity and their home lives. And students will much more likely develop a positive relationship with you, the teacher, and with what they're learning if they see that their learning is connected to their home lives and that their teacher values who they are as people. A third reason is that just naturally people learn things more efficiently and more quickly if it's taught to them in their first language. So if you had to choose between learning a complicated task in your first language or your second language that you learned in school or you learned another way, you would most likely choose your first language. You'd be more likely to remember the facts that were discussed during the lesson. You'd be more likely to explain your learning to your teacher or to your peers. So people actually learn things more effectively in their first language than in other languages. So you have to keep that in mind when you're teaching students new content, math, science, social studies. You want to first teach it in their native language, and then later you can also supplement that and reintroduce that content in students' second language. For example, the majority language, English. Fourth, teaching students in their native language also eliminates the break between home learning and school learning. If you think about it, students learn countless things before they even enter school. They learn things from their parents, they learn things from listening to music, watching TV, interacting with their siblings, reading books, and most of the time in their homes, they're interacting in their native language. So you want to make sure that you connect students' prior learning at home to what they're learning at school. You don't want to discount what they already know. Instead, you want to build on what they already know to help them in learning new content. A further reason is because If you teach students in their native language and assign them materials to take home and work and practice in their native language, parents are much more likely to be able to support their students. Also, parents are more likely to feel comfortable becoming involved in the school process if you are translating important materials in parents' native language. You're having translators at the PTA events or parent engagement nights. So it's very important as much as possible to provide that bridge between home and school by encouraging and developing students' native language. These are some really powerful quotes. I recommend that you read it on your own time. Basically, the Center for Applied Linguistics followed up with what the UN did 50 years later. And they argued that when students have their mother language recognized and supported, they feel like their culture is affirmed and supported. They feel more likely to be part of the school community. Another thing is the Center for Applied Linguistics also found very pragmatic, positive benefits for teaching students in their native language. First, students have increased academic achievement. They're more likely to do well on standardized tests and to graduate school and to be successful in their classwork. Second, students have increased self-esteem. So if students see that their culture is recognized, their content and their learning is easier for them because it's in their stronger, more proficient language. And if students are becoming more successful in school, they're more likely to develop a stronger self-esteem and feeling of self-worth. That was beneficial because when things get really difficult for them, they're more likely to persevere and have grit and keep on trying and not give up because they have that strong self-esteem and confidence. And also, another benefit is students also will be learning their second language, which is often the majority language, at a much faster pace if they have a strong foundation in their native language. There are countless skills that can transfer from your native language to your second language. Your reading comprehension skills, your knowledge of cognates, words that sound the same and mean the same across languages, your knowledge of learning strategies, how to solve problems, your content knowledge that you were taught in your native language can transfer to your knowledge in English or your second language. And there's specific phonics skills, like the sounds of that you hear across languages can transfer. Reading fluency often transfers across languages. Students with strong reading comprehension and reading fluency in their native language are much more likely to develop strong reading comprehension and effective reading fluency in their second language. So they've done research and they've actually shown that students with a stronger foundation in their native language and who had more native language instruction learned English much more quickly as their second language than students who were only taught in English all the time, who were in all English programs. And the reason why is just like with any skill. If you were a really strong athlete overall, it's much easier to learn a new sport than someone who didn't have a strong foundation in athletics, learning a totally new sport on top of that. So having that foundation really supports students' success when they learn their second language, English. Another thing is it's important that students learn their native language in school because even though they might have practiced their native language, they practice speaking and primarily listening and speaking with their parents, they most likely are not practicing at home grade level academic vocabulary or academic reading comprehension. They're not reading texts at home. They're more likely to be just primarily communicating with their parents. So we can't assume that just because students speak, let's say, Spanish at home or Vietnamese at home, that they're going to automatically develop strong grade level skills in their home languages. They might develop decent communication skills with listening and speaking, but you also want students to develop those academic foundations in reading and writing. And so you need to explicitly teach reading and writing because many times parents are either preoccupied or they don't necessarily know how to teach those concepts. So you, as the skilled educator, could help support students' foundational academic skills in their native language. So you will need to teach academic vocabulary, academic sentence structure, or how the sentence is formed, like the syntax. You need to provide them grade level texts that are academic in their native language. You need to also model the standardized form of the native language. So students who speak one dialect at home might not necessarily speak the standard form of their native language. So it's important to teach them the standard form. Another thing that they found is that providing students content instruction, so instruction in math, reading, and social studies in their native language is essential. Students are much more likely to retain that content knowledge and transfer it to when they have to apply it into their second language, English. So as a teacher, you cannot just focus on grammar and vocabulary and just learning language skills. You also need to teach students content like reading comprehension, math skills, science concepts, social studies principles in students' native language. This way, students are much less likely to fall below grade level. They've also found that strong forms of bilingual education, so dual language programs, developmental bilingual programs, heritage language programs like language maintenance and language revitalization programs, all of these programs that teach at least half of the time in students' native language and half of the time in the second language, let's say English, in those programs, students are much more likely to be successful compared to weaker forms of bilingual education. So the more native language instruction, and normally the threshold is at least half of the day, 50% of native language instruction, the more successful your English language learners will be, your bilingual students. So now we're going to get into some specific teaching strategies to support bilingual students. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, some of this might have come up already, but that's okay. It's always good to have additional practice. So first of all, bilingual students benefit from having multicultural curriculum and perspectives. So students really benefit from reading literature in their native language, as well as reading literature in the majority language. So in the United States, the majority language would be English. It's also incredibly important that students see authors of diverse cultural backgrounds, especially authors that look, talk, and resemble students themselves. It's important that students read literature with diverse characters and to also learn about historical figures that have contributed to the United States that come from their students' home cultures. You could also emphasize folk tales and traditional knowledge and cultures and traditions from students' home cultures. That's very beneficial, referencing holidays, customs, ceremonies, even foods in students' native language, native culture is very beneficial. So represent as much as possible your students' home cultures in the classroom, in the content you're teaching. Make direct connections to what you're teaching to what they have seen in their home lives. Second of all, bilingual students primarily benefit from cooperative learning. So historically in the United States, we focused on kind of the Western European style of learning, which is more independent and even competitive. However, most English language learners and bilingual students in the United States come from non-Western backgrounds. Most of them are coming from countries from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, and also Native American students. all of those groups of students particularly benefit from cooperative learning. In their cultures, it is more looked positively upon to interact as a team and as a group rather than compete against each other. There's a lot more of importance on social community development and the social well-being and community responsibilities and also family responsibilities. And so since you have a classroom community, which is like your classroom family and your classroom community, it's important that students feel that they are a part of that community and that they have cooperative learning opportunities. So, and they've also done research, and they've just shown that students that are from Latin American backgrounds, African, Native American, and Asian backgrounds prefer collaborative and cooperative work instead of independent work or competitive work where they have to compete with another student. So there's different examples. So cooperative learning features students often working in small groups, and they're working together for a mutual goal. Each student has a particular role, and each student's role is paramount to the success of the group. So the group is interdependent on each other. If one student doesn't complete their task, the other students are not successful. So there's a community responsibility and a community support mechanism where students help each other out so that all groups, the whole team, is successful. Some examples of cooperative learning could be think, pair, share, where students think of an answer, pair with a partner, and then share out to the class. You could provide formal project-based learning where you assign a real-world project and students have to solve it, come up with a conclusion based on research, and then verify and test out their conclusion. There's various reading strategies such as jigsaw reading where students read individual parts of a story or a text and then they reteach it to their partners. Any type of partner teaching such as reciprocal teaching or peer tutoring is a form of cooperative learning, and group projects and presentations of any sort are also collaborative cooperative learning. Third, bilingual students especially benefit from active learning. So you need to make your lessons as much as possible student-centered versus teacher-centered. So when I say student-centered, I mean the students are the ones that are actively doing the learning. They're the ones doing most of the talking, most of the thinking during the lesson, most of the writing. They're the ones practicing the content and explaining their knowledge, rather than just the teacher lecturing the whole time. Some examples of active learning that are very beneficial could be classroom discussions. It could be, once again, collaborative work. You could have literature circles where students work as teams to discuss literature in depth and discuss their opinions and point of view. Having students write down their own questions to ask the class can help facilitate a discussion, and having students provide feedback on their partners or their classmates' responses is another way to have active learning, where it's not just the teacher telling the student, good job, that's correct, or I agree, but it's the other students themselves that are giving feedback. Hands-on learning activities like science experiments, using manipulatives like base 10 blocks in math to solve problems, physically having to sort or organize concepts based on similar characteristics, creating an original product, a video, a poster, a presentation, a speech to explain what they've learned. All of those are hands-on learning. And then writing circles are also beneficial, where students brainstorm together. They go through the writing process of pre-writing. They write out their drafts. They share their drafts, give feedback and editing to each other, and then students conduct their own individual editing and publish their work. A fourth thing to remember is that bilingual students also benefit from comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is just a fancy way of saying that students understand what the teacher is saying. The students understand the lesson. So to ensure comprehensible input, you want to make sure that you just your communication style and your communication of the lesson based on students' English levels. So a handy way to do this in Texas is to look at their TELPAS levels from the year before. If a student is a beginning or intermediate student, then you're going to need to substantially slow down your instruction. You're going to need to pause regularly. You're going to need to enunciate and pronounce things very clearly so that students understand. You're going to need to provide hands-on learning opportunities, as much first language support as you can. So that could be providing cognates from one language to the other, translated texts, videos in students' native language, and if possible, if you know how to do this, if you speak their native language, pre-teach the content first in students' native language, then go into teaching it in English. For students who are advanced or advanced high in their English skills, you can probably deliver the lesson at a normal speed, but you still want to frequently pause and check to make sure all students are understanding what you're saying. So asking questions, having them do some practice activities where they're working with implementing the knowledge and you giving them feedback is important. Also, you still need to provide those scaffolds. So scaffolds are beneficial for all learners. So visuals, hands-on learning, real objects, manipulatives, all of those things are beneficial. Another thing is you want to make sure that you model to students how to speak and complete sentences and to elaborate on their thoughts. So one way to do that is by asking students how or why. So students have to really formulate their ideas and really elaborate in somewhat of a complex way of what they're thinking. And you're going to need to model that first to students, how to write a complex sentence with because or since or for. So students learn how to not just write a simple sentence or speak a simple sentence like, I like the book, but rather make it more of a complex sentence, like, I like the book because it had a strong main character. Another thing is you want to make sure you frequently model whatever activity you're assigning students. You want to make sure you model it and students practice that activity with you several times before you set students off to work on it on their own. Avoid using idiomatic language like you will attract more flies with honey than vinegar. So that's a unique phrase in English that doesn't necessarily translate directly to other languages. Another one would be like, time flies when you're having fun. If you're using a lot of idioms or even really complicated academic vocabulary that's above students' grade level or vocabulary that students have not heard before, you're going to lose many of your students, especially your English language learners who haven't been exposed to those idioms and some of that academic vocabulary. As much as possible, when you're explaining the lesson, try to use simplified syntax. So just be very direct with short sentences, subject, verb, object. If you need to, for important content, you can repeat it or even paraphrase it in different words if you feel like students still are not getting it. Also, illustrate cognates across languages. So an example in English and Spanish would be oxygen in English and oxígeno. Those words sound the same, they're spelled the same, and they mean similar. They mean the same. So illustrating those cognates can help students make a direct transfer from their native language to English. Write down instructions on the board or in an anchor chart. Make sure that you conduct the lesson in a step-by-step manner. And as much as possible, when you're doing each step or when you're writing down the directions, provide visuals and maybe a physical modeling to further reinforce the skills that you're doing during the lesson. Try to use gestures, body language, real objects to demonstrate the lesson. Model the process. For example, go over and model several math practice problems. Model the concept with a science experiment or demonstration. When students get new content, you need to teach them how to preview the material and preview the material with students. So for a fiction book, for the younger grades, a great way to preview material is to do a picture walk where the teacher flips through the pages and students make predictions based on the picture what the story is going to be about. Another way to do this for nonfiction text is to have students preview the text by looking at the text features. So what was in the title? What are the images in the text? What are the captions under the images explaining what the images mean? What are words that are in bold print? Are there headings below the title that separate each section of the article? Having students understand how to analyze each of those text features will help them understand what the article's about before they actually even start reading. Fifth is that bilingual students benefit from contextual support. And contextual support is very similar to comprehensible input. It's basically supports that allow students to understand better what the other person is saying, or support to help them understand the context of what they're reading. So we talked about this already, but the more difficult the lesson gets, the more contextual support you need to provide to English language learners. So this could be providing visuals, gestures, pantomime, real objects, repeated modeling, hands-on learning, manipulatives, demonstrations, sentence stems. All of these things are important contextual supports. So students understand what's going on. So they might not understand every single word you're saying or every single word in the book or the text they're reading. However, with those contextual supports, they're getting the main idea, the gist. Here's some other examples. I'm actually going to release a subsequent video about English language learner scaffolds, and we're going to go into each one of them in particular. But here's some ones that you could see. So some contextual support that students might see within the text itself could be pictures or bolded print or captions next to the pictures, graphs and charts, guided notes. So having students do their own guided notes with you that you pass out, or having a summary of the text at the end of the chapter, in-text definitions. All of these are ways to provide contextual support. Another thing is bilingual students and English language learners benefit from learning scaffolds or supports. And this is beneficial for all students as well. So some scaffolds we haven't talked about could be partnering bilingual students with someone who's a more proficient speaker so that they learn proper phrasing, proper pronunciation, and more elaborate communication skills and academic vocabulary from someone who has a more advanced ability. If you're just sticking students with people of the same language level, they're not going to progress as much as if they were placed in a mixed ability group where they could learn from their peers. Sentence stems are very beneficial in providing a scaffold for ELL students and all students to communicate using academic vocabulary in a complete sentence. So a sentence stem might be like, the main idea of the story is, or I think that, or that is a very good point, but, so students are filling in the rest, but they're getting that model of correct phrasing and how to speak in a complete sentence and how to answer specific types of questions. Pre-teaching academic vocabulary is very beneficial so that students can keep track of the lesson. Bilingual dictionaries that they can help do their own translations if needed, or picture dictionaries are very beneficial as well. Going over specific learning strategies, like if you don't understand it the first time you read, stop and reread more slowly the paragraph, annotate the text, write notes by the text to help remember. look for clues in the text to help understand it, like pictures or bolded print or things that are repeated over and over in the story. Those are clues of how to understand, and all of those are learning strategies. And I'm going to try to make another video just on learning strategies, so hopefully that will be beneficial. Seventh, bilingual students and English language learners benefit from translanguaging. So you shouldn't just separate the two languages, or even worse, say, no, don't speak Spanish in class, only speak English. You shouldn't do that, because instead, you should actually connect both languages together and allow opportunities for students to use both their native language and English during class time. And that's basically translanguaging. It's basically a planned, systematic use of both languages in the classroom. So an example might be if first the students read a text in their native language, then they discuss it with their partners in their native language. Then they read another text in English and they discuss that text in English or their native language. And then finally they get a third text in either the English or their native language, and they have to discuss it in the other language that was not the text that was written. So basically students are using both languages regularly during the lesson, and that helps facilitate transfer of knowledge and skills from their native language to English. Also, students are much more likely to comprehend the text if they're seeing the text both in their native language and in English. And furthermore, students will develop skills in areas they might be weak in. So you might have students that are very strong in their native language with listening and speaking, but they might not be as strong in reading and writing. So if you provide translanguaging opportunities where students, let's say, read the text in English, then they explain it to their partners in Spanish, and then they write it down, they write a response to questions in Spanish, they're practicing with those weaker language skills. And so they're developing not only what they already know, but further developing and strengthening all parts of the 4 language domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Another thing is, if you provide translanguaging opportunities and you provide resources in students' native language and in English, students have a much more likelihood of receiving support from their parents. And then in a dual language classroom where half the class are, let's say, native Spanish speakers and half the class are native English speakers, a great way to do translanguaging would be to have some assignments on a similar topic in one language, and then the other assignments in another language. And then let's say you're doing assignments in Spanish, you would have this native Spanish speakers kind of take the lead and help peer tutor and peer support native English speakers who are still learning Spanish, or still have a very beginner level of Spanish. And then let's say you start assigning some other activities that are related to that topic, let's say the water cycle. In English, what you could do is the English speakers who have a stronger proficiency in English would then help peer tutor and peer support the native Spanish speakers who are still maybe beginning and intermediate English speakers. So basically, providing opportunities for students to peer tutor each other. Another thing is, it's very important that bilingual students and English language learners receive culturally appropriate communication practices. And you've probably seen this, but cultures interact in different ways. In the United States, we're very straightforward, direct with what we say. We often just go straight to the point. We do not have a problem with voicing our opinions or our disagreement or critique of something. Well, in other cultures, especially non-Western cultures like African cultures, Native American cultures, Latin American cultures, and Asian cultures, communication is different. Communication is not valued as being just straightforward, direct get to the point and move on. Communication is like an art form. So these cultures, African, Latin American, Asian, and Native American cultures, are much more high context cultures. People really, before they get to their main point, they develop a relationship with the speaker. They get to know them. They get to know their families. They build a commonality or common goals. They also use much more nonverbal elements like gestures, hand and eye movements. They don't always go straight to the point, especially if they're in disagreement with something. They subtly introduce their point of view, and eventually they get to their main point without attempting to hurt the listener's feelings. People also there's less focus on having this personal bubble where personal space has to be 3 to 6 feet. In some high context cultures like Latin American cultures, African cultures, Asian cultures, and Middle Eastern cultures, people interact at a closer physical space. They are not so fixated on keeping this boundary, this large separation between one person and the other. And then another thing to note is in those cultures, it's very important to build up trust and to connect to someone's personal experiences and personal preferences, to build that relationship and to justify the point of view based on the listener's perspective. So trying to find commonalities between both the speaker and the listener is very important. And there's also a lot more focus on community and the importance of developing things for the social benefit for all people and for the families and for preserving family dynamics. Okay. Oh, so going back to that, sorry. So when you're communicating with your students, it's important that you communicate in a way that's appropriate to their culture. So and you shouldn't force your cultural communications on them right away. For example, you might have students that come from East Asian cultures that don't look at you straight in the eye when they talk to you. And the reason why is because it's rude in those cultures to look at an elder in the eye. Another situation might be in some cultures, men and women are not supposed to interact very closely and sit very closely to each other, especially if they're above puberty age. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, I'm not saying that you have to adapt and change your communication style completely so that you only communicate in the way that your students are accustomed to be communicating, but you need to have open and honest conversations with students and explain where you come from, where your cultural background is for communication, how people communicate in the United States, and how, and also to get feedback from them where they explain how people communicate in their culture. Then you can mutually come to an agreement on what would be the way that you all can communicate in an effective way, promoting the mutual success of the class. Ninth, it's very important that bilingual students see a direct connection with what they're learning now to what they've learned before. So you need to connect students' prior knowledge. You need to, and the way you can do that is you can have do chapter previews or anticipation guides where students look over the chapter ahead of time and then think about how their chapter relates, or the content that they're learning now relates to what they learned before in earlier grades, or what they learned at home. Maybe having them make connections or doing a KWL chart where they write down what they know, what they want to learn, and what they learned about a topic. Make sure that you connect your lesson to students' home cultures, their personal experiences, their personal beliefs, their holidays, their traditions, their foods, their role models. An example of this would be, for example, in Mexico, the concept of a tooth fairy is very different. It's actually it's called El Ratoncito Perez. It's like this little rat basically, but he works almost like a tooth fairy. But so if you're going to teach a lesson, I don't know why you would do this per se, but let's say you're reading a book about the tooth fairy, you need to connect it also to El Ratoncito Perez if you have students from Mexican cultures. Or there's wonderful stories that explain Cinderella from different cultures. And so that's important to look at as well. Some other ways you can build background knowledge is you can directly relate what you're teaching to the day before. So explain the order of the process, like why you're teaching this current content now, and this order, and how it relates to what you taught before. Have students share what they've seen at home or their prior experiences, or what they've read on their own. So have students have time to talk with their partners about their previous learning experiences, and also to share with the class so they can form connections with the content. Another thing is to make sure you build up students' academic background knowledge in their vocabulary skills. So you want to make sure you pre-teach academic vocabulary for students. And so when you're pre-teaching academic vocabulary before you get into the real lesson, it's really important that you choose the most important words that students need to learn. So the most important words that students should learn, that should be reviewed with students before you get into the actual lesson, are high frequency, high impact words. So they're words that students will see over and over, not just in your class, but in other classes, in math classes, science classes, social studies classes, and other grades. Words that are essential to understanding the meaning of what they're reading or what they're learning, and also words that they'll use over and over later in life. And so some examples of some high frequency, high impact words that are cross content words could be like theory or occupation or resources. You're going to be using those words over and over throughout your life in whatever grade level and content area you're studying. And so having students develop that foundational knowledge and teaching them those words explicitly is important, because then you can teach the actual lesson and students will not feel lost. So before you give them a new text or you discuss a new topic, make sure you go over some key words to give them an idea of what they're about to learn. That way, when you get to those words in the book or during the lesson, students won't be lost, or they won't be confused, or they won't interrupt you and ask, what does that mean? Another thing for teaching vocabulary is you want to make sure you contextualize it. So you want students to see how vocabulary works in reality, how it's used in practice. So one way to do this is to make sure students have multiple exposures to the word. So seeing the word in various texts, seeing visuals of the word, making their own visual, creating their own definition of the word, acting out the word, thinking of examples and non-examples of the word, or synonyms and antonyms if students are at that level. Making sure that you focus on maybe 3 to 5 important words rather than covering 100 words just really quickly without having students practice. It's much more meaningful to have breadth it's much more meaningful to have depth in your instruction than breadth. By that I mean it's a lot more valuable to go really in depth on, let's say, 3 to 5 vocabulary words per week, compared to giving students a list of 20 vocabulary words where they have to memorize. They're likely not to be able to remember them all after a long time. However, if you have students repeatedly practice with the word, write their own sentences with the word, maybe visually represent the word, act out the word, and they're seeing the word and having repeated exposure to the word, then they're more likely to remember that word compared to just having to memorize a list of vocabulary. All right, so these are Sorry, I cut myself off. So these are some great overarching strategies to supporting bilingual students and English language learners. And so remember, an English language learner is most likely a bilingual student. They most likely speak two languages. They might not be served in a bilingual program, but they are bilingual because they know both languages, their native language from home and English. So I kind of use those terms interchangeably. And so another thing to note is that the skills we talked about today are beneficial not just for bilingual students, English language learners, but also all students. Thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate it. Thank you.